Hello, we're at the EAWOP conference in Oslo in 2015 and I'm interviewing Daan van Knippenberg. So Daan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, it will be my pleasure. So I'm Daan van Knippenberg. I'm a professor of organizational behavior at the Rotterdam School of Management, where I study primarily leadership with the question in mind, what does it take for leadership to inspire people to not only do great things in the sense of being innovative, creative, but also be happy and fulfilled in doing this.
Thank you. You talked today in your keynote about values-based leadership. Why do you think that's particularly important?
Over the years, I've done a lot of leadership research and focused on a lot of different elements of leadership. And over the years, I've come to the conclusion that if I could only have a limited amount of time to tell people about what makes for really good leadership, for instance, like in a leadership development program, whatever, executive education, I get to work with people for 2 days, or in an executive MBA, I get to work with people with 20 hours of contact, whatever. What is most important to tell them? And I came to the conclusion that it is actually what I call value-based leadership. So the notion of inspiring people by communicating a value-based purpose for the organization. So what is it we're trying to do, and why is this so interesting and important? Why is it valuable to contribute to? Because I think it goes to the heart of the matter. It goes to the heart of why we have organizations, why we have leadership in organizations, and why it can be a great thing. Isn't always a great thing, but why it can be a great thing to work in an organization.
And that makes a lot of sense, particularly in some organizations where there's an obvious aim and purpose. But what about for the ordinary shop worker or accountant? Can values-based leadership be relevant there?
Well, I think to a certain extent it should be and can be. I think there's always a case to be made that there is more meaning in work than people often see in it. And maybe this is especially true beyond the obvious cases. Like if you have this really obvious case where it's so obvious to see what you're contributing. Like today in the keynote, I gave the example of Doctors Without Borders, where it's so obvious that the work they do is inspired by a desire to make a contribution beyond yourself, by caring for people, providing healthcare to people that need it but couldn't get it otherwise. You could almost say, well, if there wouldn't be value-based leadership there, I think there is, but if there wouldn't be, these doctors would get it anyway. So maybe you don't need it. But there are other places where the invitation to disengage and to get alienated from work might be a lot higher, where it could be especially valuable. Maybe it's not so easy or not so clear or not so obviously inspiring what the value-based purpose of the organization is. But to the extent that you can define and articulate this, maybe it's even more important. Mm-hmm. So I would say that by and large, to some degree at least, it should be inspiring everywhere, whatever we do. And in those few places that I can think of where maybe it isn't, actually maybe we shouldn't be doing those things. If it doesn't serve a value-based purpose, maybe we shouldn't work there, have those organizations.
So does values-based leadership, does it have something to do with morality?
I think it has a lot to do with morality. So I don't mean it so the way I mean it is it's not defined by morality. It's defined by explaining why the organization does what it does and why it does what it does in terms of values. But the linkage with morality is, I think, strong and obvious. The more you are guided by your values, the more you are focused on what is appropriate and inappropriate, what you should and should not do. So this should more broadly guide your behavior in a moral way. Mm-hmm. So I would expect that value-based leadership as a side effect results in a more morally grounded behavior than working, organizing and leadership without this strong anchoring in values.
Mm-hmm. And how does values-based leadership relate to improving performance in organizations?
Okay, so I think it's of course an important question. I think there are two answers to the question. The one is it should, at least is what I predict. So I think a strong theory to say that what value-based leadership should do is intrinsically motivate proactive contributions to the organization's purpose. So whatever the organization is trying to do, trying to achieve, you will be more motivated to contribute to this with value-based leadership. And we know that intrinsic motivation is good for performance. We know that it's good for creativity and innovation. It's good for people's well-being. So it should be more sustainable in that sense. So that's the conceptual answer. The evidence answer is, I don't know, because I just started studying this. So what I have for on the agenda for the next couple of years is producing the evidence that it's actually also good for performance and creativity and whatnot. And the only evidence I have so far is very modest. It's showing that it is good for people's self-rated experience of inspiration in their work. So if I ask people to rate the extent to which they're inspired doing their job, they see meaning in their job, they score higher on this when they see more value-based leadership. But that's not the same as performance. So ask me again in a year.
So what do you see as the research agenda for values-based leadership?
Okay, so I think that there's a couple of things that are important. The one most obvious thing from an academic perspective is we should test the theory. So we should just get the basics of what I predict have to do with how value-based leadership should inspire proactive contributions to what the organization stands for, the purpose of the organization. So this could be understood in terms of performance, but also other outcomes, and the mediating process in terms of identity processes. So I think the most important thing from an academic perspective is testing those basic predictions. At the same time, what is for me an inspiration to do this is that I also really strongly believe that it can be really powerful for leadership development. That it speaks to something that people can really believe in and can really be open to embracing for their own leadership. And then the question is, and this is also a research question, what would help disseminating these insights in a leadership development program like executive education or an MBA, personal leadership development program or whatever. And then I think case material is really important. So getting examples where you can really unpack how value-based leadership works out in a specific context that you can actually describe. So I think we have the quantitative research to test the theory, and then the qualitative research to enrich the theory, but also to get basic building blocks for leadership development programs, because it's more easily accessible to people in practice if you can have the cases as examples and use them to work with. So I think the research agenda would have a strong focus also on practice, and ideally, and this is what I hope I can also have manage over the next couple of years, there would also be some evidence that if you have specific programs focused on developing value-based leadership, you can also evaluate them in quantitative research and show the evidence that it actually is possible to train and develop those elements of leadership. So there is evidence that this can work in leadership development. That would definitely also be part of my research agenda.
Okay. And how do you see that? Is there a relevance to this in academia? I mean, as an academic, does your thinking about values-based leadership affect the way that you, in your role as an academic and a leader?
In terms of how I would do my own work, right? So I say that the value basis in academic work. I would say there is and there should be. I think it helps me at least be more aware of what's important in our work. So the side effect of thinking about values-based leadership is that it makes me think more about what is worth investing my time in and what it is I should be pursuing. And it helps you make choices in what is more or less interesting research, or what are more or less exciting teaching opportunities, or the message I should, as this more leadership kind of thing, the message I should convey to the more junior people I work with about what they should be seeking in their work. For instance, as a concrete example, because this sounds very abstract. I recently was asked to give a presentation about how to manage your career as a scholar. It's kind of saying, well, these are PhD students, tell them from your sort of experience and grossly overestimated wisdom what you think is important in building an academic career. And many people are very much in a system that's so focused on you should get so many publications in such and such journals, and you should get this and that. It's really a tick the box bean counting kind of system. And if you're not careful, those become the ends, and you forget about why you should be doing what you're doing. And then I was grateful for the opportunity to say, well, you know, passion is the fuel of science. You should really believe in what you're doing. You should try to do stuff that's important, that contributes knowledge that is meaningful and important within science, but also within society. And the rest then is important as how you, in terms of, for instance, how you disseminate this. You'll have a bigger audience for what you say if you publish it in a top journal. But you shouldn't forget that why you're doing it is not to publish in a top journal. That's a means to an end. And I think if I would have given a presentation like that 10 years ago, I might have put more emphasis on the, to use that ugly term, key performance indicators, and less on the underlying values that are being served by what we do. So it has also increased my awareness of why we do what we do and why it's important.
And finally, thinking about your career as an occupational psychologist and organisation, what brought you into it, and what sort of reflections do you have from where you are about somebody that might be thinking about going into the area?
So what brought me into value-based leadership or into
organisational psychology generally?
I think it was sort of by accident, actually. I started out studying psychology because I thought human behavior was really interesting. So I didn't go beyond, well, this sounds really interesting and more interesting than the alternatives. And then I was really interested in social psychology because I thought social behavior was most interesting and more than, you know, the clinical elements or whatever, or than the organizational elements of it. So I started out my career as a social psychologist, did a PhD in social psychology. But the field was changing, and what I actually thought was most interesting, social influence processes, team processes, etc., was actually what was being studied in organizational psychology more and more, and in social psychology less and less. So in a sense, I felt that if I really would want to follow my heart and study what I thought was most interesting as a social psychologist, organizational psychology was the place to be, rather than the very cognitive, micro processes that were studied in social psychology more and more. So, and this is a general trend, I think. At a certain point, there was also a review of the teams literature where the reviewers, Moreland and Levine, concluded groups are alive and well but living elsewhere. So social psychology used to study it, but now it's the business school at OrgPsych that studies it. So I kind of moved from social psych to org psych and now to the business school with that trend, just following what my interests and ending up in org psych. And then I think in retrospect it was also, even though it didn't make such a conscious choice in that sense, a brilliant choice nevertheless. Because I think part of ultimately what we do in generating knowledge, in disseminating knowledge, is to make contributions to society. And in org psych, you're so much better positioned, or in the business school, so much better positioned to do this, to disseminate your knowledge to people that are actually going to use it, whether it's an MBA program, or it's exec ed, or it's working with a company, than I've ever been in social psych. And then I see virtually everybody in social psych being able to do. So in the end, it's I wish I could say that it was a really conscious decision to step by step do it like this, but I'm really happy that it worked out like this.
Okay, well, thank you, and you've nicely brought us back to values-based leadership.
There you go.
To end the interview. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.